Robert's secretary handed me his personal effects with the same mechanical efficiency she'd shown scheduling his appointments for 23 years. The betrayal I felt staring at those keys hidden in his office safe was nothing compared to what I'd discover behind that cabin door. Because inside wasn't just Robert's secret, it was mine. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. You might wonder how a woman who considered herself reasonably intelligent could live with a man for 3 decades without knowing he was hiding something this big. Well, let me tell you exactly how that happens. It started with Robert's monthly fishing trips. Every 3rd Saturday, like clockwork, he'd pack his old duffel bag, kiss my forehead, and announce he was heading up to Pine Ridge Mountain for some solitude and trout. "You'd hate it up there, Helen," he'd always say, not unkindly, but firmly. No cell service, no running water. Just me, the fish, and my thoughts. I believed him because why wouldn't I? Robert Hamilton was the most predictable man in Tennessee. At 71, he ate the same breakfast every morning, wore his ties in weekly rotation, and had read the newspaper in the exact same order for our entire marriage. The idea that this creature of habit was capable of elaborate deception seemed absurd. Besides, I had my own life, my book club, my garden, my volunteer work at the hospital. I actually enjoyed having the house to myself once a month. I could watch my British mysteries without Robert's commentary about unrealistic forensics, eat ice cream for dinner without judgment, and spread my quilting projects across every surface without apology. The trips had been going on for 8 years. 8 years of monthly disappearances that I'd never questioned, never doubted, never thought to investigate. Maybe I should have been suspicious when he started leaving at dawn and returning well after midnight, or when he began coming home more tired than anyone should be after a relaxing day of fishing. But Robert had always been an early riser and a thorough man. If he was going to fish, he was going to fish properly. The first crack in my certainty came 6 months before Robert's heart attack. I was doing laundry when I noticed something odd about his fishing clothes. They smelled wrong. Not like lake water or pine trees, or even that musty outdoor smell you'd expect. They smelled like vanilla and lavender, like someone else's fabric softener. I held that shirt up to my nose, breathing in that foreign scent, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. But when I asked Robert about it, he had a perfectly reasonable explanation. "New bait shop opened up in town," he said, without looking up from his newspaper. "Lady who runs it has everything scented. Says it attracts fish better. Reasonable, logical, classic Robert." I put the shirt in the washer and pushed the feeling away. The second crack came when I found the receipts. Not fishing receipts, grocery receipts. Hidden in his tackle box were dozens of them, all from a small market in Pine Ridge I'd never heard of. The purchases were strange. Fresh flowers, gourmet coffee, expensive cheese, wine. Nothing you'd buy for a solitary fishing expedition. When I confronted him, Robert barely blinked. "Sometimes I get tired of gas station food. A man can treat himself to decent coffee and cheese. Can't he? The flowers are for your mother's grave on the way back." Another perfectly reasonable explanation. My mother was buried in Pine Ridge Cemetery. Robert had always been thoughtful about visiting her. But now, staring at those keys in my palm, I realized that reasonable explanations from a reasonable man could hide unreasonable secrets. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of casseroles and condolences and people telling me how lucky I was to have had such a devoted husband. If only they knew what I was about to discover. I should have let sleeping dogs lie. Should have donated his effects to charity and moved on with my grieving. But I've never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. Ask anyone who knows me. Helen Hamilton finishes every crossword puzzle, reads every mystery novel to the end, and always needs to know the truth, even when that truth might destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The drive to Pine Ridge took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. I knew because I'd made Robert time it once when we were dating, back when I still thought I might occasionally join him on these mysterious fishing expeditions. Funny how a person can live with someone for decades and still remember the small details from the beginning. The mountain road wound through thick pine forests that looked exactly like the peaceful wilderness Robert had always described. Maybe he really had been fishing all this time. Maybe those keys would unlock nothing more scandalous than a fishing cabin with outdated equipment and mouse droppings. But the grocery receipts kept nagging at me. Fresh flowers every month for 8 years. That was a lot of devotion to my mother's memory. I'd called the cemetery office before leaving Memphis. Mrs. Hamilton? Oh yes, your husband visited faithfully. Such a sweet man, always brought flowers. Though I have to say, he spent an awful lot of time at that other grave too. Other grave? The one right next to your mother's. Young woman. Died about 10 years ago. Sarah Mitchell. He always brought flowers for both graves. Sarah Mitchell. The name meant nothing to me, but something about the way the cemetery worker said it made my stomach clench, like she'd assumed I knew, like any wife would obviously know why her husband was tending a stranger's grave. The GPS led me past the cemetery, past the small market where Robert had bought all those groceries, and up a narrower road that I'd never traveled. The houses grew farther apart, the trees thicker, until finally the voice announced, "In 200 feet, turn right." The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Exactly the kind of rustic fishing retreat Robert had always described. One story, weathered wood siding, green metal roof, a porch with 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them. Window boxes with fresh flowers in November. I sat in my car for 10 full minutes, engine off, keys heavy in my palm. Part of me wanted to start the engine, drive away, and pretend I'd never found Robert's secret. Some discoveries change everything, and once you open certain doors, you can never close them again. But I've always been too curious for my own good. Robert used to tease me about it. "Helen," he'd say, "curiosity killed the cat, you know." "Good thing I'm not a cat," I'd always reply. I walked up the porch steps on unsteady legs. The key fit perfectly into the front door lock. Of course it did. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The cabin was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the rough, masculine fishing lodge I'd imagined, I found myself in a cozy, feminine space that looked like it had been decorated by someone with exquisite taste and unlimited patience. Soft blue walls covered with framed photographs, a kitchen with cheerful yellow curtains and a vintage tablecloth, a living area with a comfortable sofa and matching armchair, both covered in fabric that coordinated perfectly with the curtains. Fresh flowers, the same yellow chrysanthemums from the window boxes, arranged in a crystal vase on the mantel. This wasn't a fishing cabin. This was a home, someone's carefully created, lovingly maintained home. And judging by the framed photographs covering every available surface, that someone was a beautiful woman with dark hair and Robert's eyes. No, wait, that was wrong. Robert had her eyes. I picked up the nearest photograph with shaking hands. A young woman, maybe 30, holding a baby. The inscription on the frame read, "Sarah and Emma Mitchell, 2014. Sarah Mitchell." The woman buried next to my mother. I sank onto the sofa, my legs suddenly unable to support me. In 30 years of marriage, Robert had never mentioned a Sarah Mitchell. Never mentioned a daughter. Never mentioned this place where he'd been building a secret life one Saturday per month. The coffee table held a recent issue of Better Homes and Gardens and a small leather journal. I opened the journal to a random page, and Robert's familiar handwriting stared back at me. November 15th. Emma's school play is next week. Sarah's mother is bringing her by on Saturday so I can help with her costume. She wants to be a butterfly. Sarah would have loved seeing her in something so beautiful and delicate. Emma, a granddaughter I'd never known existed. I flipped through more pages, and the truth of Robert's deception began to unfold. Sarah hadn't been his affair. She'd been his daughter. His daughter from before we met, given up for adoption when he was barely 19. A daughter who'd found him 8 years ago, and slowly, carefully, built a relationship with the father she'd never known. A daughter who died 3 years later, leaving behind a little girl who looked just like Robert. A little girl who'd been visiting her grandfather every month in this cabin that Robert had bought and furnished just for her. A secret family he'd kept hidden from me for reasons I was only beginning to understand. Because how do you tell your wife of 30 years that you've been living a double life? How do you explain that while she thought you were fishing alone, you were actually playing grandfather to a child whose existence proves you'd kept secrets from the very beginning of your marriage? I closed the journal and looked around the cabin again. Every detail spoke of love and careful attention. The child-size rocking chair on the porch, the art supplies organized in neat containers, the refrigerator covered with crayon drawings, signed Emma. Robert hadn't been having an affair. He'd been having a relationship with his granddaughter, in secret, because he'd been too ashamed or too afraid to tell me the truth about Sarah. But if Emma had been visiting every month until Robert's death, where was she now? And who was taking care of a little girl who'd just lost the only father figure she'd ever known? The kitchen held more answers than I was prepared for. The refrigerator was covered with children's artwork, school photos, and what looked like report cards. Emma Mitchell, age 9. Honor roll every semester, it seemed. Robert had been keeping track of everything. I opened the refrigerator and found it fully stocked. Fresh milk with yesterday's date. Sandwich meat that wouldn't expire for another week. Someone was still using this cabin. Someone was still coming here regularly. A folded piece of paper tucked behind a photo of Emma caught my attention. I pulled it out and recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. Helen, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found my keys. I should have told you about Sarah and Emma years ago, but I was afraid you'd think less of me for keeping secrets. Sarah was my daughter from before we met. She found me 8 years ago, and Emma is her little girl. After Sarah died, Emma had nowhere else to go except with her great-aunt Margaret in town. I've been helping support them and spending time with Emma here every month. Margaret brings her up here because Emma needs this connection to her mother's memory and to me. I hope you can forgive me for not telling you sooner. All my love, Robert. I stared at that letter for a long time, feeling the weight of Robert's deception settling around me like a heavy coat. Not just the secret of Sarah and Emma, but the secret of his fear. He'd been so afraid that I wouldn't understand, wouldn't accept this part of his life, that he'd chosen to live a double life rather than trust me with the truth. The worst part was, he might have been right. Would I have welcomed Robert's secret daughter and granddaughter into our orderly life? Or would I have seen them as complications, disruptions to the peaceful retirement we'd planned? I'd like to think I would have been understanding, supportive. But honest reflection forced me to admit that my first reaction to finding this place hadn't been joy for Robert's expanded family. It had been betrayal, anger at being deceived. Maybe Robert had known me better than I knew myself. A car door slammed outside, jolting me from my thoughts. Through the kitchen window, I watched an older woman with gray hair help a young girl out of a silver sedan. The woman looked to be about my age, wearing jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days. The girl was maybe 9 or 10, with Robert's dark hair and unmistakable features. Emma. They were walking toward the cabin with the casual familiarity of regular visitors. Emma was chattering animatedly about something, her small hands gesturing as she talked. The woman, Margaret, presumably, listened with the patient attention of someone who genuinely cared about what the child was saying. I panicked. What was I supposed to do? Introduce myself as the wife who'd been kept in the dark for 3 years? Pretend I'd just happened to find this place? Hide in the bathroom until they left? Before I could decide, they were on the porch. Emma's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. Grandpa Robert always left the door unlocked for us, Aunt Margaret. He said this was our safe place where nobody could hurt us. The front door opened, and Emma bounded inside with the confidence of a child who considered this her second home. She stopped short when she saw me standing in the kitchen doorway. "Who are you?" she asked, with the directness that only children possess. Margaret appeared behind her, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Emma, come here, sweetheart." "I'm Helen," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I was Robert's wife. Margaret's expression shifted from wariness to understanding, then to something that might have been pity. "Oh," she said quietly, "you found the keys." Emma looked between us with confusion. Grandpa Robert had a wife? He never talked about a wife. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 3 years of monthly visits, Robert had never mentioned me to this child. In her world, he was simply Grandpa Robert, who lived alone and devoted himself entirely to her needs. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "why don't you go put fresh water in your mother's flowers while Mrs. Hamilton and I talk?" Emma nodded and skipped toward the mantel, clearly familiar with this routine. I watched her carefully remove the chrysanthemums from their vase and head toward the kitchen sink, completely at home in this space that was foreign to me. "She doesn't know about you," Margaret said in a low voice. Robert thought it would be too confusing for her. Too many adults to keep track of. How long have you known? I asked. About you? Since the beginning. Robert told me he was married when Sarah first contacted him. He showed me your picture, talked about your garden, your book club. He was proud of you, but he was also terrified. Terrified of what? Margaret glanced toward the kitchen where Emma was humming while she arranged flowers. Terrified that if he told you about Sarah and Emma, you'd make him choose. And he couldn't choose between his old family and his new one. The truth of that statement settled into my bones. Robert had been caught between two worlds. The life we'd built together and the family he'd never known existed until Sarah found him. Instead of trusting me with the truth, he'd chosen to live in both worlds simultaneously, fully present in neither. What happens to Emma now? I asked. I take care of her full time. Robert helped with expenses, but Margaret's voice trailed off, and I heard the worry she wasn't voicing. But now that Robert's gone, the money's gone too. Margaret nodded. I'm on a fixed income. Emma's a good kid, but raising a child at my age, with my resources. She shrugged, trying to look matter-of-fact, but I could see the exhaustion around her eyes. Emma returned with the freshly arranged flowers, placing them precisely in their spot on the mantel. There, Mama, she said softly to a framed photograph I hadn't noticed before. Grandpa Robert always said you liked them just like this. I stared at the photograph of Sarah Mitchell and felt something shift inside my chest. She looked so young, so hopeful. A girl who'd grown up without a father and had spent her brief adult life trying to build a relationship with the man who'd given her away. And now her daughter was trying to preserve that connection through monthly visits to a cabin that might not be available much longer. Because that was the other piece of this puzzle I was only beginning to understand. This cabin, this furniture, these monthly visits, it had all been funded by Robert. And now that Robert was gone, Margaret couldn't afford to maintain this place on her own. Emma was about to lose her grandfather, her monthly retreat, and quite possibly her guardian, all in one devastating blow. Unless someone stepped in to help. Someone with the resources and, maybe, the responsibility to ensure that Robert's granddaughter didn't become another casualty of adult failures and family secrets. I looked at Emma arranging her mother's flowers with such careful devotion and realized that maybe Robert's deception had been more complex than simple cowardice. Maybe he'd been protecting all of us. Emma from the disruption of adult complications, me from the pressure of unexpected responsibilities, and himself from having to choose between two different definitions of family. But now the choice was mine, and unlike Robert, I couldn't keep living in two separate worlds. Would you like some coffee? Margaret asked, clearly trying to fill the awkward silence that had fallen over the cabin. Robert always kept a pot going when we visited. I nodded, grateful for something to do with my hands while my brain processed this new reality. Emma had settled onto the sofa with a worn book, reading with the intense concentration that reminded me painfully of Robert. Margaret moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, obviously familiar with where everything was kept. Robert was a good man, she said quietly as she measured coffee grounds. But he was scared of disrupting your life, scared of asking too much from you. He should have trusted me, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. Should he have? Margaret's question was gentle but pointed. Would you have welcomed a 9-year-old girl and her elderly guardian into your retirement plans? I started to give the automatic answer. Of course, naturally, without question. But Margaret's steady gaze forced me to examine my true feelings. Would I have been understanding about Robert's secret daughter? Probably, eventually. But would I have embraced monthly visits from a grieving child and her financially struggling guardian? Honestly, I didn't know. Robert used to say you were the kindest woman he'd ever known, Margaret continued, but that your kindness came from a place of order and planning. He was afraid that springing a ready-made family on you would be like throwing a stone into still water. So instead, he chose to lie to me for 3 years. He chose to protect all of us. You from obligation you might not want, Emma from rejection she couldn't handle, and me from— Margaret paused, considering her words. From the possibility that you might not approve of the arrangement. The coffee finished brewing, and Margaret poured 2 cups. She added cream to both without asking how I liked mine. Clearly, she'd been paying attention to Robert's descriptions of me over the years. "What did he tell Emma about these visits?" I asked. "That Grandpa Robert lived by himself and needed her company, that this cabin was their special place where they could remember her mother together. She's been coming here since she was 6, Mrs. Hamilton. This place is as much home to her as anywhere else." I watched Emma reading on the sofa, her legs tucked under her in a way that was pure childhood comfort. She belonged here in a way I never would. This cabin had been created for her, furnished with her needs in mind, filled with memories of a relationship I'd never been part of. "The lease on this place runs through the end of the year," Margaret said carefully. "After that, you can't afford to keep it." Margaret shook her head. "My Social Security barely covers our basic needs in town. This place, the monthly trips, the extra expenses, it was all possible because Robert helped." I sipped my coffee and thought about Robert's life insurance, the money that was now sitting in my bank account waiting for me to decide what kind of widow I wanted to be. The practical widow who paid off her mortgage and put the rest into safe investments. Or the widow who honored her husband's secret commitments, even if she'd never agreed to them. "How much did Robert contribute monthly?" I asked. Margaret looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hamilton, I don't want you to think we're asking for anything. Emma and I will be fine. We'll figure something out." "How much?" $800 for the cabin lease, gas for the trips, groceries, Emma's school supplies, and clothes. Robert was very generous. $800 a month, nearly $10,000 a year. For 3 years, Robert had been quietly funneling a significant portion of his retirement income toward supporting a family I'd known nothing about. I thought about our budget discussions, the way Robert had always pushed for conservative spending, insisting we needed to be careful with our money. Had he been pinching our pennies so he could be generous with Emma's expenses? "Mrs. Hamilton?" Emma's voice broke through my calculations. She was standing beside my chair, holding her book. "Are you mad at Grandpa Robert for not telling you about us?" The question was delivered with the casual directness that only children could manage, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes. This little girl had already lost her mother and grandfather. Now she was worried about losing her safe place and her guardian because of adult complications she couldn't understand. "I'm not mad," I said, and realized as I spoke that it was true. "I'm confused and a little hurt that he felt he couldn't tell me about you. But I'm not mad." Emma nodded solemnly. "Aunt Margaret says adults sometimes make things more complicated than they need to be. Aunt Margaret is very wise. Are you going to take the cabin away from us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret started to scold Emma for being forward, but I held up my hand. "Why would I do that?" I asked. "Because it's yours now, right? Everything that was Grandpa Robert's belongs to you now?" Smart girl. Too smart for her own good, probably. "Some things belong to me now," I said carefully, "but other things belong to your relationship with Grandpa Robert. Those things might be different." Emma studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to read a foreign language. Finally, she nodded and returned to her book, apparently satisfied with my non-answer. But Margaret was watching me with a different kind of attention. The attention of someone who was beginning to hope, but was afraid to hope too much. The truth was, I had no idea what I was going to do. 3 hours ago, I'd thought I was investigating my husband's potential infidelity. Instead, I'd discovered a secret family that had been central to his life for 3 years. A family that was now essentially orphaned, dependent on the kindness of strangers or the charity of a widow who was still processing the fact that they existed. Robert had left me more than just life insurance money. He'd left me the responsibility for decisions that would shape a little girl's future, decisions he'd been too afraid to trust me with while he was alive. The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert had spent 3 years protecting me from having to make choices about Emma and Margaret. Now, because of his secrecy, I was the only one who could make those choices, and I had to make them without any guidance from the man who'd understood these people, loved them, and carefully built this entire secret world around their needs. Thanks a lot, Robert, I thought. Way to leave me holding the bag. But even as I felt frustrated with my husband's deception, I was beginning to understand something else. Looking at Emma reading contentedly in her grandfather's chair, at Margaret watching over her with fierce protectiveness, at this cabin that represented stability and love for a child who'd lost too much already, I was beginning to see what Robert had seen. This wasn't a burden he'd hidden from me. It was a gift he'd been too afraid to share. The question now was whether I was brave enough to accept it. "Emma, why don't you go check on your mother's flowers while Mrs. Hamilton and I finish talking?" Margaret suggested after we'd sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. Emma nodded and skipped outside, clearly familiar with this routine. Through the window, I watched her carefully tend to the window boxes, talking softly to the plants as if they could hear her. "She talks to Sarah out there," Margaret explained. "Tells her about school, her friends, things that worry her." Robert encouraged it, said it was healthy for her to maintain that connection. "How did Sarah die?" I asked, realizing I'd been assuming but not actually knowing. "Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light on Emma's 7th birthday. They were coming home from Chuck E. Cheese." Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear years of grief underneath. "Sarah was my niece. When my brother died 10 years ago, I was all the family she and Emma had left, until Sarah found Robert." The pieces of this complicated family puzzle were starting to fit together. Sarah, raised by her great-aunt after losing her adoptive parents. A single mother working hard to give her daughter a good life, finding her birth father just in time to give Emma a grandfather before tragedy struck again. "Robert never talked about giving up a child for adoption," I said. "He was 31 when Sarah was born. Jennifer died in childbirth, and Robert thought a closed adoption was best. He had no idea Sarah was even looking for him until she showed up at your house 8 years ago." "She came to our house?" Margaret nodded. "Robert said you were at your book club. Sarah knocked on the door, showed him the documents she'd gotten from the adoption agency. Robert said he nearly had a heart attack right there on your front porch." I tried to imagine that scene. Robert, confronted with a daughter he'd never expected to see again, standing on the porch of the life he'd built without her. No wonder he'd been terrified. "Why didn't he just tell me?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand the answer. "Because you'd been trying to have children for years, and it never happened. Robert said you'd finally made peace with being childless, and he was afraid that suddenly having a ready-made family might bring back old pain. That stopped me cold. Robert had been protecting me from my own grief about infertility. The irony was devastating. While I'd spent years mourning the children we'd never had, Robert had been secretly rebuilding a relationship with a child I'd never known existed, a child from his previous marriage that ended in tragedy long before we met. "He should have trusted me," I repeated, but with less conviction this time. "Maybe. But Robert wasn't just thinking about you. He was thinking about Emma, too. What if you couldn't accept her? What if you asked him to choose?" Emma had already lost so much. Through the window, I watched Emma carefully deadhead the flowers, her small hands gentle with the delicate blooms. She moved with the confidence of someone who felt completely safe in this space, completely loved and accepted. "Robert adored that little girl," Margaret continued, "but he was also realistic about what he could provide. He couldn't be a full-time guardian at his age, and I couldn't afford to care for her without help. This arrangement, monthly visits, financial support, maintaining this cabin as her retreat, it worked for everyone, until Robert died." "Until Robert died," Margaret agreed. Emma came back inside carrying a small bouquet of flowers she'd apparently picked from somewhere on the property. "These are for you," she said, presenting them to me with a shy smile. "Grandpa Robert always said flowers made everything better." I accepted the bouquet, surprised by the gesture. The flowers were simple, wildflowers and a few roses from what must be a garden behind the cabin, but they'd been arranged with the same care Emma had shown with her mother's flowers. "Thank you," I said. "They're beautiful." Emma beamed. "Grandpa Robert taught me how to pick the best ones. He said you have to choose flowers that are just starting to open, not the ones that are already full. The just starting ones last longer." The wisdom of that statement hit me unexpectedly. Just starting flowers. Relationships that had room to grow rather than ones that had already peaked. Maybe that was what I was looking at here. Not the ending of Robert's deception, but the beginning of something new. "Emma," I said, "would you like to show me around the cabin? I'd like to see the places that were special to you and Grandpa Robert." Emma's face lit up. "Really? You want to see our special places?" For the next hour, Emma gave me a tour of the cabin that revealed just how much thought Robert had put into creating this space. The reading nook by the window where they'd worked on homework together. The kitchen table where they'd played board games and done jigsaw puzzles. The porch where they'd sat in the evening, watching the sunset and talking about Sarah. Every corner of this place held memories I'd never been part of, stories I'd never heard. But instead of feeling excluded, I found myself feeling honored. Honored that Robert had found this kind of joy, had been able to give this much love to a child who needed it, and honored that Emma was willing to share these memories with me, even though I was a stranger who represented uncertainty about her future. "This is my favorite spot," Emma said, leading me to a window seat that looked out over the forest. "Grandpa Robert put cushions here just for me. Sometimes we'd sit here when it rained and make up stories about the animals in the woods." I sat beside her on the cushions, looking out at the view that Robert had gazed at once a month for 3 years. It was peaceful, restorative. I could understand why he'd found this place healing. "Emma," I said carefully, "what would you think if I wanted to keep coming here sometimes? To see this place that was special to Grandpa Robert?" Emma considered this seriously. "Would you come when Aunt Margaret and I come, or different times? I was thinking maybe when you and Aunt Margaret come, if that would be okay with you." Emma studied my face with that intense scrutiny that children use when they're trying to determine if an adult can be trusted. "Would you try to change things?" she asked finally. "What kind of things? Would you want to paint the walls different colors or move the furniture around? Adults sometimes want to change things that are already perfect." I looked around the cabin at the careful decorating choices that reflected both Robert's practical nature and what must have been Sarah's feminine touches. Everything here worked together harmoniously. Nothing needed changing. "No," I said. "I think everything here is perfect just the way it is." Emma nodded, satisfied with my answer. "Then it would be okay if you came with us. Aunt Margaret gets tired driving up here by herself, and I worry about her." Smart girl. She'd figured out how to present my involvement as something that would help Margaret rather than something she needed herself. But I could see the hope in her eyes, the relief that maybe her monthly refuge wasn't about to disappear. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, she found Emma and me sitting companionably on the window seat, looking out at the forest that Robert had loved. "Time to head back, sweetheart," Margaret said. "School night." Emma nodded and began gathering her things with the efficient movements of someone who'd made this transition many times. But before she headed to the car, she stopped in front of me. "Mrs. Hamilton, thank you for not being mad about us. Grandpa Robert was worried you might be mad." "He told you that?" Emma shook her head. "Not exactly, but sometimes when Aunt Margaret and I talked about you, he got that look adults get when they're worried about something they don't want to explain. Out of the mouths of babes." This child had been reading Robert's anxiety about his deception for 3 years, carrying the emotional weight of his secret without fully understanding what she was carrying. "I'm not mad," I assured her. "And Emma, I'm very glad I got to meet you." After they drove away, I sat alone in the cabin as the afternoon light faded. Robert's journal was still on the coffee table, and I opened it to the first entry, dated 3 years ago. "Sarah brought Emma to meet me today. I can't believe this beautiful little girl is my granddaughter. She looks just like Sarah did at that age, but she has my stubborn chin. I hope Helen can forgive me for not telling her about this yet. I know I should, but I'm afraid of disrupting the peace we've found. Maybe next month I'll find the courage." I flipped through dozens of entries. "Next month I'll tell Helen. I need to find the right way to explain this to Helen." Emma asked if she has a grandmother, and I didn't know what to say. 3 years of monthly promises to himself that he'd find the courage to trust me with the truth. 3 years of carrying this secret alone because he was too afraid of my reaction to discover whether his fears were justified. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before his heart attack. Emma's teacher says she's the most mature 9-year-old she's ever had in class. Too mature, probably. This child has dealt with more loss than most adults. I wish I could give her more stability, but this monthly arrangement is the best I can do. Margaret is getting older, and I worry about what will happen when I'm gone. I need to tell Helen soon. Emma deserves to have all the family she can get, even if it's complicated. Robert had finally been ready to tell me. 2 weeks too late. I closed the journal and looked around the cabin one more time. This place represented Robert's attempt to balance his love for me with his responsibility to Emma. He'd tried to honor both relationships without sacrificing either, and the effort had cost him 3 years of secrecy and worry. Now the choice was mine. I could walk away from this complication, this ready-made family that had never asked for my involvement, or I could honor Robert's commitment to a little girl who'd already lost too much. Really, it wasn't much of a choice at all. I drove back to Memphis with my head spinning and my heart heavier than it had been in weeks. The discovery of Emma and Margaret had completely rewritten my understanding of Robert's final years. Instead of the peaceful retirement we thought we were sharing, he'd been managing a complex emotional juggling act that must have been exhausting. By the time I reached home, I'd made a decision. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was contemplating. I spent that evening going through Robert's financial records with new eyes. The monthly withdrawals I'd attributed to his fishing hobby suddenly made perfect sense. $800 every month, like clockwork. Sometimes more when Emma needed school clothes or when the cabin required maintenance. Robert had been incredibly careful about this. The money came from his personal account, never from our joint household funds. He'd managed to support Emma and Margaret for 3 years without affecting our standard of living at all. His secretiveness hadn't been just about emotional protection. It had been about financial protection, too. He'd made sure that his generosity to his secret family never came at my expense. The man I'd thought was simply frugal had actually been supporting 2 households. The husband I'd occasionally worried was becoming stingy in his old age had actually been quietly generous to people I'd never known existed. I called Margaret the next morning. "Mrs. Hamilton, is everything okay? I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," I said. "About the cabin, about Emma, about what happens now." Margaret was quiet, waiting. "Robert left me a substantial life insurance policy," I continued. "I think he would want some of that money to continue supporting Emma." "Mrs. Hamilton, you don't owe us anything. Robert's arrangement with us was his choice. You weren't part of that agreement. Maybe not originally, but I'm part of it now." I took a deep breath. "I'd like to take over the cabin lease and continue the monthly support Robert was providing, if that's acceptable to you." The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had been dropped. "Margaret, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice was thick with emotion. Are you sure? This is a big commitment and you don't really know us." "I know enough. I know that Robert loved Emma enough to rearrange his entire life around her needs. I know that you've been caring for her with limited resources and infinite patience. And I know that Emma deserves stability and continuity, especially now. What about the visits? Emma looks forward to coming to the cabin every month. It's her connection to her mother and to Robert. I'd like to continue those too, if you're comfortable with me joining you sometimes." Another long pause. "Emma would love that. She talked about you the whole drive home yesterday. You made a big impression on her. She made a big impression on me too." We worked out the practical details over the next few days. I would take over the cabin lease and provide the same monthly support Robert had been giving. Margaret and Emma would continue their monthly visits, and I would join them when I could. We'd see how the arrangement worked for everyone. But first, I needed to do something Robert should have done years ago. The following Saturday, I drove to Pine Ridge with a car full of supplies and a heart full of nervous energy. I'd spent the week shopping for Emma, art supplies, books, games that seemed appropriate for a 9-year-old girl. I had no idea what she liked, but I figured we had time to learn together. I also brought photo albums, pictures of Robert from before I knew him, from our wedding, from holidays and vacations over the years. If Emma was going to be part of our family story, she deserved to see all of it. Margaret and Emma were already at the cabin when I arrived, sitting on the porch in the rocking chairs. Emma jumped up when she saw me, her face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Hamilton! Aunt Margaret said you might come today, but I wasn't sure you really would." "I said I would, didn't I?" Emma nodded solemnly. "But adults sometimes say things they don't mean, especially when kids are involved." The matter-of-fact way she said this broke my heart a little. This child had learned too young not to trust adult promises completely. "Well, I meant it," I said, "and to prove it, I brought some things to share with you." I spent the next hour showing Emma photographs of her grandfather at different stages of his life. Her favorite was a picture of Robert at age 10, grinning toothlessly at the camera while holding up a fish he'd caught. "He looks just like me when I lost my front teeth," Emma exclaimed. She was right. The resemblance was unmistakable. "Tell me about this one," Emma said, pointing to our wedding photo. I told her about the day Robert and I got married, about how nervous he'd been, and how he'd forgotten his vows and had to improvise. Emma giggled at the idea of her grandfather being nervous about anything. Were you sad that you didn't have children? Emma asked with the directness that no adult would have dared. Yes, I said simply. We wanted children very much. Emma considered this. But if you'd had children, then Grandpa Robert might not have had time for me. The innocent logic of that statement stunned me. From Emma's perspective, my childlessness had been a gift to her. It had ensured that her grandfather had space in his life for a relationship with her. You're probably right, I said. So maybe everything worked out the way it was supposed to, Emma said with the profound acceptance that children sometimes possess. Maybe it had. As the day wore on, I began to understand what Robert had found so compelling about these visits. There was something peaceful about the rhythm of life at the cabin. No schedules to keep, no obligations beyond enjoying each other's company. Emma was an easy child to be around. Curious, thoughtful, independent enough not to require constant entertainment. When she disappeared into the bedroom for a nap, Margaret and I sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the afternoon light filter through the trees. She's going to be okay, Margaret said quietly. I was worried after Robert died that she might retreat, might close herself off from getting attached to anyone new, but she's resilient. She has you, I pointed out. She has us now, Margaret corrected gently. If you're serious about this arrangement. I'm serious. Margaret nodded. Good. Because Emma needs all the family she can get. And frankly, so do I. Raising a child at my age is challenging, even with help. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two women who'd been brought together by Robert's secret and were now trying to figure out how to honor his intentions. Can I ask you something? Margaret said eventually. Of course. Are you doing this out of obligation? Because you feel like it's what Robert would have wanted? I thought about that question carefully. Partly, I admitted, but not entirely. Yesterday, when Emma showed me around the cabin, I saw how much this place means to her, how much her relationship with Robert meant to her. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure she doesn't lose this connection to him. And I like her. I like spending time with her. She's smart and funny, and she sees the world in ways that surprise me. Maybe I'm doing this as much for me as for her. Margaret smiled. Robert said you were kind. He also said you were practical. Sounds like this decision is both. When Emma woke from her nap, she found us still on the porch. She climbed into the rocking chair next to mine and curled up like a contented cat. Mrs. Hamilton, she said sleepily. Yes? Would it be okay if I called you Grandma Helen? I know you weren't married to Grandpa Robert when I was born, so you're not really my grandmother. But Aunt Margaret says sometimes families are made by choice, not just by blood. I felt tears spring to my eyes. I would be honored if you called me Grandma Helen. Emma smiled and closed her eyes again, rocking gently in her chair. And just like that, I became a grandmother to a child I'd never known existed. In a place my husband had hidden from me for 3 years, as part of a family I was still learning to understand. Robert had been right about one thing. This was complicated. But as I sat there watching Emma doze in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the evidence of her grandfather's love and care, I realized that complicated didn't necessarily mean wrong. Sometimes complicated just meant real, and real was something I'd been missing more than I'd realized. But there was still one more revelation waiting for me in that cabin. One more piece of Robert's puzzle that would change everything I thought I understood about his motivations. And I was about to discover it in the most unexpected way possible. 3 weeks later, I was settling into the routine of monthly visits when Emma asked a question that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Grandma Helen, are you going to keep coming here forever, or just until you get tired of us? We were sitting on the porch after lunch, watching Margaret tend to the flower boxes. The question came out of nowhere, delivered with the casual tone children use for earth-shattering inquiries. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Emma shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Adults say they'll do things, but then they change their minds. Especially when taking care of kids gets hard. The matter-of-fact way she said this broke something in my chest. This child had learned not to trust adult promises completely. How many people had disappointed her before I came along? Emma, look at me. I waited until her serious brown eyes met mine. I made you a promise. I don't break my promises. But what if you get sick? What if you decide you don't want to spend your money on us anymore? What if you meet someone new? And they don't like me. The cascade of worries revealed how much this 9-year-old had been carrying. She'd been analyzing every possible way this arrangement could fail, preparing herself for another abandonment. Those are a lot of scary thoughts for such a little person to be having, I said gently. I'm not little. I'm 9 3/4. Margaret looked up from the flowers, catching my eye with a meaningful glance. She'd obviously heard this conversation before. You're right. 9 3/4 is very grown up, I agreed. Grown up enough to hear the truth about adult promises. Emma waited. The truth is, I can't promise I'll never get sick or that nothing will ever change. But I can promise that no matter what happens, I will never abandon you the way other people have. If something happens to me, I'll make sure you're taken care of. How? The directness of the question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. What would happen to Emma if something happened to me? Margaret was 75 and already struggling with the physical demands of caring for a child. Was I making promises I couldn't keep? I'm working on that, I said honestly. I'm talking to lawyers about making sure you and Margaret are protected no matter what. Emma studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to read a foreign language. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but Grandma Helen? Yes? Can we make it official? Can you be my real grandmother? Not just my grandfather's wife? The innocent request hit me unexpectedly hard. Emma wanted legal protection, family status that couldn't be taken away by adult complications or changing circumstances. What do you mean by official? Aunt Margaret says there are papers that make families real. Papers that say you have to take care of me even if you don't want to anymore. I looked at Margaret, who was pretending to focus intently on deadheading flowers while obviously listening to every word. You've been talking about this with Aunt Margaret? Emma nodded. She says if something happened to her, I might have to go live with strangers unless someone in my family could take care of me. But you're not really my family yet. You're just Grandpa Robert's family. The logic was painful, but accurate. I had no legal relationship to Emma. If something happened to Margaret, I'd have no standing to prevent Emma from being placed in foster care. But was I ready to make that kind of commitment? Legal guardianship wasn't the same as enjoying monthly visits and providing financial support. It meant taking full responsibility for a child's life, potentially for the next 9 years. Emma, that's a very big decision. It would mean you might come live with me permanently. It would mean I'd be responsible for your school, your doctor visits, everything. Would that be bad? It wouldn't be bad, but it would be different. Very different from the life I've been living. Emma was quiet for a moment. Grandpa Robert said you were brave. He said you could handle anything if you decided you wanted to. Hearing Robert's faith in me through Emma's innocent repetition made my eyes sting with unshed tears. What else did Grandpa Robert say about me? He said you had a big heart, but you were careful about letting people in. He said that was smart, because not everyone deserves to be in your heart. But he also said that once you loved someone, you loved them forever. Robert had understood me better than I'd realized. And apparently, he'd been preparing Emma for the possibility that she might need to trust me completely someday. Emma, if I did decide to become your legal guardian, it would take time. There would be lots of meetings and paperwork and people asking questions. What kind of questions? Questions about whether I'm capable of taking care of you properly, whether I have enough money, whether I'm healthy enough, whether I really understand what I'd be promising. Emma nodded solemnly. Those are good questions. Do you know the answers? Did I? At 69, was I really prepared to start over as a parent? Did I have the energy, the patience, the emotional resources that a grieving child would need? I'm still figuring out some of the answers, I admitted. That's okay, Emma said with the generous forgiveness that children sometimes possess. Adults don't have to know everything right away. But as I watched Emma return to her book, I realized she did deserve to know some things right away. She deserved to know that she was safe, wanted, and valued. She deserved to know that the adults in her life were thinking seriously about her future, not just reacting to crises as they arose. That evening, after Margaret and Emma had gone back to town, I sat alone in the cabin thinking about Robert's journal entries, his monthly promises to himself that he'd find the courage to tell me about his secret family. Maybe Robert's real legacy wasn't the deception he'd carried for 8 years. Maybe it was the example he'd set of loving someone enough to rearrange your entire life around their needs, even when it was inconvenient, expensive, and complicated. The question was whether I had inherited Robert's capacity for that kind of love, or just his talent for avoiding difficult decisions. But Emma's question echoed in my mind. Are you going to keep coming here forever? Or just until you get tired of us? The child deserved a better answer than I'm still figuring it out. She deserved the security of knowing that at least one adult in her life was prepared to choose her, permanently and without reservation. The question was whether I was brave enough to be that adult. I drove home from the cabin that night, with Emma's words playing on repeat in my mind. By the time I reached Memphis, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I called my lawyer first thing Monday morning. James, I need to understand the legal process for becoming a child's guardian. Specifically, what would be involved if I wanted to become Emma Mitchell's legal guardian? James was quiet for a moment. Helen, that's a significant step. Have you thought this through completely? I'm thinking it through now. That's why I'm calling you. Over the next hour, James walked me through the complexities of guardianship law, background checks, home studies, financial evaluations, psychological assessments. The process could take 6 months to a year, assuming no complications. The court's primary concern will be whether guardianship is in Emma's best interest, James explained. They'll want to know why you're seeking this responsibility and whether you're prepared for the long-term commitment. What are the biggest obstacles I'd face? Your age, honestly. At 69, you'd be raising a child who won't reach 18 until you're 78. The court will want assurance that you have backup plans if your health fails. What kind of backup plans? Naming a secondary guardian in your will. Demonstrating that you have family or friends who could step in if needed. Financial planning to ensure Emma's care would continue even if you became incapacitated. After hanging up with James, I sat in my kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold while I'd been lost in thought. Was I really considering turning my quiet retirement into 9 years of active parenting? My phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Helen? I hope I'm not calling it a bad time, but Emma had nightmares last night. She was talking in her sleep about foster homes and strangers. My heart clenched. What did she say? She kept saying, "Please don't make me go with them." She was reliving something. Helen. Something from before she came to live with me, I think. What happened before she came to live with you? Margaret was quiet for a moment. After Sarah died, there was a brief period when the authorities weren't sure where to place Emma. She spent 2 weeks with a temporary foster family while they located me. It wasn't a good experience for her. What do you mean? They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. Emma was just another placement to them. She told me later that they made her feel like she was a burden they had to tolerate until someone else could take her. The image of Emma feeling unwanted and afraid made me physically nauseated. Margaret, what if something happens to you? What would happen to Emma? That's what keeps me awake at night, Helen. I'm 75 with high blood pressure and arthritis. Every day I worry that I might have a stroke or a heart attack, and Emma would end up back in the system. Is there anyone else? Any other family members? No one. Sarah was my niece, but my brother died years ago. Emma's father was never in the picture. I'm all she has. The weight of that statement settled around me like a heavy blanket. Emma's security depended entirely on the health and longevity of a 75-year-old woman with medical issues. Margaret, what would you think if I applied to become Emma's legal co-guardian? Not to take her away from you, but to provide backup protection if something happened to you? The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had been dropped. Margaret, are you there? I'm here. Helen, that would be an enormous responsibility for you. Are you sure you understand what you'd be agreeing to? I'm not sure of anything, except that Emma deserves more security than she currently has. It would mean she might come live with you full-time if I became unable to care for her. I know. It would mean being responsible for her education, her medical care, her emotional needs. It would mean being a parent at 69. I know that too. Margaret was crying now. Helen, I can't ask you to do this. You're not asking, I'm offering. But why? You've only known Emma for 2 months. I thought about Emma's question on the porch, about her nightmares about foster care, about the way she'd learned not to trust adult promises completely, because she's Robert's granddaughter, and she deserves to know that someone will choose her permanently, because she's already lost too much, and I can't stand the thought of her losing more. And because? And because I love her, I admitted, the words surprising me as they came out. I didn't expect to, but I do. I love her enough to rearrange my life around her needs if that's what she requires. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house thinking about the chaos that would come with full-time parenting, the noise, the schedules, the constant needs and questions and demands for attention. Then I thought about Emma's face when she'd asked if I would get tired of her, the anxiety of a child who'd learned that adult love could be conditional and temporary. I called James back. I want to start the guardianship process. Helen, I have to ask this officially. Are you certain you understand the commitment you're making? James, I've never been certain of anything in my life, but I'm certain that Emma deserves someone who's willing to fight for her security. All right then, let's begin. That evening, I drove back to Pine Ridge for an unscheduled visit. I found Margaret and Emma having dinner at the cabin, apparently having decided to extend their monthly stay by a day. Grandma Helen! Emma jumped up from the table. You came back! I had some things to discuss with you and Aunt Margaret. Emma's expression immediately became serious. Are you in trouble? Did I do something wrong yesterday? No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you said something that got me thinking. I sat down at the table with them. Emma, remember when you asked about making it official? About me becoming your real grandmother? Emma nodded, suddenly very still. I talked to my lawyer today. I want to apply to become your legal co-guardian. Emma stared at me without speaking. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. What does co-guardian mean? Emma asked finally. It means I'd have the legal right to take care of you if anything happened to Aunt Margaret. It means you'd never have to go live with strangers. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Really? You'd really do that? I'd really do that. But Emma, it's a big process. There will be lots of meetings and people asking questions. And it means if you did come live with me, there would be lots of changes. What kind of changes? You'd have to switch schools, make new friends, live in a different house with different rules. Emma considered this seriously. But I'd still get to come here, to the cabin? Absolutely. And Aunt Margaret would still visit? All the time. Emma looked at Margaret. What do you think, Aunt Margaret? Margaret was crying again. I think Grandma Helen is giving you the most precious gift anyone could give you. The gift of knowing you'll always be safe and loved. Emma nodded solemnly. Then she launched herself into my arms with such force that she nearly knocked me off my chair. Thank you, she whispered into my neck. Thank you for choosing me. As I held Robert's granddaughter in my arms, I realized that this wasn't just about providing security for Emma. It was about honoring the kind of love Robert had shown her. Love that was willing to sacrifice convenience and comfort for another person's well-being. Robert had rearranged his life around Emma's needs for 8 years. Now it was my turn to do the same. The question was no longer whether I was brave enough to be Emma's guardian. The question was whether I was brave enough to be the kind of grandmother she deserved. The guardianship process began with a mountain of paperwork that made me question my sanity. Financial disclosures, medical records, background checks, references from people who could vouch for my character and stability. We need at least 6 character references, the family court clerk explained. People who can speak to your ability to provide stable care for a child. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, staring at the forms and trying to think of 6 people who knew me well enough to vouch for my parenting potential. The truth was, Robert and I had lived a fairly insular life. We had neighbors, church acquaintances, my book club friends, but no one who really knew me intimately. This was going to be harder than I'd anticipated. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams, our family physician for the past 15 years. Helen, how are you holding up? Dr. Williams had been wonderfully supportive after Robert's death. I'm doing something that might surprise you, Patricia. I'm applying to become legal guardian for a child. A child? Helen, whose child? I explained about Emma, about Robert's secret family, about the current situation with Margaret. My goodness, Helen. That's quite an undertaking at our age. I know it sounds crazy, but Patricia, would you be willing to provide a medical reference? To confirm that I'm healthy enough to care for a 9-year-old? Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment. Helen, I'll be honest with you. At 69, taking on full-time parenting is a significant physical and emotional challenge. Are you prepared for that reality? I'm not prepared for anything, but I'm committed to learning. All right, but I want you to come in for a comprehensive physical first. If you're going to do this, we need to make sure you're in the best possible health. My next call was to Ellen Morrison from my book club. Helen, dear, how are you managing? Actually, Ellen, I'm calling because I could use your help with something. I explained the situation again. Ellen was shocked into silence. You want to become a guardian? Helen, that's wonderful, but are you sure you've thought this through? Everyone keeps asking me that. No, I haven't thought it through completely. But Ellen, would you be willing to serve as a character reference? Of course, dear. But Helen, have you considered what this will mean for your social life? Your freedom? 9-year-olds require constant attention. After I hung up, I realized that everyone's reaction was the same. Supportive but worried that I hadn't considered the full implications of what I was proposing. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being impulsive, making a decision based on emotion rather than logic. That evening, I called Emma. Grandma Helen, are you coming to visit us this weekend? I'm planning to. Emma, can I ask you something important? Sure. Are you really sure you'd want to live with me full-time? It would be very different from living with Aunt Margaret. Emma was quiet for a moment. Different how? Well, I've never raised children before. I might not know how to help with homework or handle problems at school. I might make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, Emma said matter-of-factly. Aunt Margaret makes mistakes too, but I still love her. But Emma, I'm older than most parents. Then I might not be able to do all the things younger parents do. Like what? Like playing sports with you or staying up late or having lots of energy for activities. Emma considered this seriously. Grandma Helen, do you love me? The simple question caught me off guard. Yes, sweetheart. I do love you. Then the other stuff doesn't matter so much. Love is the most important thing. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma, what if other kids at school think it's weird that your guardian is so old? Then those kids are dumb, Emma said with fierce certainty. You're not just old, you're wise, and you're mine. The possessive way she said you're mine made my heart crack open. After we hung up, I called Margaret. How honest should I be with the social workers about my concerns? I asked. What concerns? That I'm 69 years old with no parenting experience taking on a child who's already experienced significant trauma. That I might not have the energy or skills she needs. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Helen, can I tell you something about Emma that might help? Please. She doesn't need you to be a young, energetic parent. She needs you to be consistent, reliable, and present. She needs to know that when you say you'll be somewhere, you'll be there. That when you make a promise, you'll keep it. But what if I can't keep up with her? What if I get overwhelmed? Then you'll ask for help. You'll call me, or her teachers, or her doctor. You'll build a support system around both of you. Margaret paused. Helen, do you want to know what Emma told me yesterday? What? She said, Aunt Margaret, Grandma Helen keeps her promises. When she says she's going to do something, she does it. That's the most important thing about grown-ups. I felt tears sting my eyes. She said that? She's learned to value reliability above everything else, Helen. She doesn't need you to be perfect. She needs you to be dependable. 2 weeks later, I had my first meeting with Mrs. Sarah Chen, the social worker assigned to evaluate my guardianship application. Mrs. Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a professional manner that immediately put me at ease. Mrs. Hamilton, I have to say this is an unusual case. Most guardianship applications come from relatives or family friends who've known the child for years. I understand that my situation is unconventional. Tell me why you want to become Emma's guardian. I'd practiced this answer, but sitting across from Mrs. Chen, I realized I needed to speak from my heart rather than reciting prepared responses. Because she's my husband's granddaughter, and she deserves to know that someone will always choose her. Because she's already lost too much, and I can prevent her from losing more. And what do you think you can offer Emma that her current situation doesn't provide? Long-term security. Margaret is wonderful, but she's 75 with health issues. Emma worries constantly about what will happen to her if something happens to Margaret. Mrs. Chen made notes as I spoke. Emma's file indicates she's had some previous trauma related to placement instability. Yes, she spent 2 weeks in foster care after her mother died. It wasn't a good experience. And you believe you can provide the stability she needs? I believe I can provide permanence. a legal commitment that can't be taken away by changing circumstances. Mrs. Chen spent the next hour asking detailed questions about my finances, my health, my support system, my parenting philosophy. Some questions I answered confidently. Others revealed gaps in my preparation that made me nervous. Mrs. Hamilton, I'll be honest with you. Your age is a concern. The court will want assurance that you have contingency plans if your health fails. I'm working with my lawyer on that. Naming backup guardians, setting up financial trusts, all of it. Good. I'll also need to interview Emma separately, and I'll want to observe you two together in your home environment. After Mrs. Chen left, I sat in my quiet house, trying to imagine Emma's belongings filling the spare room, her voice echoing through the hallways, her daily needs restructuring my carefully ordered routine. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. But Emma's voice echoed in my memory. You're not just old, you're wise. And you're mine. Maybe that was enough to build on. 3 months into the guardianship process, I received a call that changed everything. Helen, it's Margaret. I'm at the hospital. My blood went cold. What happened? Are you all right? I had chest pains this morning. Emma called 911. The doctors think it was a mild heart attack. Oh my God, how is Emma? Where is she? She's here with me. But Helen, she's terrified. She keeps asking if she's going to have to go live with strangers now. I was already reaching for my car keys. I'm on my way. The drive to Pine Ridge felt endless. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Margaret's condition was more serious than she'd let on? What if Emma was placed in emergency foster care before I could get there? I found Emma sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hospital waiting room, looking impossibly small and scared. She launched herself into my arms the moment she saw me. Grandma Helen, Aunt Margaret's heart is broken. The doctors are trying to fix it, but what if they can't? Sweetheart, Aunt Margaret is going to be okay. The doctors are taking very good care of her. But what if she dies like Mama did? What if I have to go away again? The raw terror in Emma's voice made me hold her tighter. Emma, listen to me. You are not going away. No matter what happens, you're not going back to strangers. But the guardianship papers aren't finished yet. The social worker lady said it takes more time. Smart child. She understood exactly how precarious her situation was. Emma, remember what I promised you, that I would never abandon you? Emma nodded against my shoulder. I keep my promises. Even if the paperwork isn't finished, I will not let anyone take you away from me. Over the next few days, the full scope of Margaret's condition became clear. She'd had a mild heart attack, but her overall cardiovascular health was worse than anyone had realized. The cardiologist recommended significant lifestyle changes and ongoing monitoring. I can still take care of Emma, Margaret insisted from her hospital bed. This was just a scare. But Emma, sitting quietly in the corner chair, looked like she was preparing herself for another loss. Dr. Martinez, Margaret's cardiologist, was blunt when he spoke with me privately. Mrs. Morrison is 75 with significant heart disease. The stress of caring for a child full-time isn't advisable. She needs rest, reduced responsibility, and careful monitoring. What are you saying? I'm saying that if Emma is going to continue living with Mrs. Morrison, there need to be significant support systems in place. Daily help, respite care, backup plans for emergencies. That evening I had a difficult conversation with Margaret and Emma. Margaret, I think we need to accelerate the guardianship process. Emma needs stability, and you need to focus on your health. Margaret looked relieved and guilty at the same time. Helen, I hate to put this burden on you. It's not a burden. It's what Robert would have wanted. Emma had been unusually quiet during our conversation. Finally, she spoke up. Does this mean I have to move to Memphis now, before the court says it's okay? Mrs. Chen, who'd been working overtime to expedite our case, explained the options. We can petition for emergency temporary guardianship given Mrs. Morrison's health crisis. It would allow Emma to live with you immediately while we complete the full evaluation process. What does that involve? An expedited home study, immediate placement, and a court hearing within 2 weeks instead of 6 months. I looked at Emma, who was watching me with the intense attention of someone whose entire future was being decided by adult conversations she could barely understand. Emma, how would you feel about coming to live with me right away? Before we originally planned? Emma considered this seriously. Would I still get to visit Aunt Margaret in the hospital? Every day if you want to. And we'd still go to the cabin? Absolutely. And if the judge decides I can't stay with you permanently, I wouldn't have to go to foster care. The question revealed how carefully she'd been listening to adult conversations, how much she understood about the legal complexities of her situation. Emma, I give you my word. No matter what any judge says, you will never go to foster care. I will fight for you until there are no more fights to fight. Emma nodded solemnly. Okay, I think I'd like to live with you now. 2 days later, I watched Emma pack her belongings into garbage bags, all her worldly possessions fitting into 3 black trash bags and a cardboard box. Is this everything? I asked, shocked at how little she owned. I don't have very much stuff, Emma said matter-of-factly. Mama used to say that people are more important than things. As we loaded her belongings into my car, Margaret pulled me aside. Helen, there are things about Emma you need to know. She has nightmares sometimes. She's afraid of thunderstorms. She still talks to her mother when she's upset. Tell me everything. She's incredibly mature for her age, but she's still a child who's experienced significant loss. She'll test you, Helen. She'll push to see if you'll abandon her like others have. I won't. I know you won't. But she doesn't know that yet. The drive back to Memphis was quiet. Emma sat in the passenger seat, clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked like it had been loved nearly to death. Grandma Helen? Yes, sweetheart. Are you scared? The honesty of the question demanded an honest answer. A little bit. Are you? A little bit, too. That's probably normal when families are just starting to figure each other out. Emma nodded. Aunt Margaret says being scared and being brave are the same thing sometimes. Aunt Margaret is very wise. As we pulled into my driveway, Emma looked at my house, soon to be our house, with the careful attention of someone memorizing important details. It's bigger than I thought, she said. Is that good or bad? Good, I think. There's room for both of us without being crowded. That first night, as I tucked Emma into the bed we'd hastily set up in the spare room, she asked one more question. Grandma Helen, do you think Grandpa Robert would be happy about this? About me living with you? I thought about Robert's monthly visits, his careful provision for Emma's needs, his 8 years of devoted grandfather love. Emma, I think Grandpa Robert planned this all along. I think he knew that someday you and I would need each other. Emma smiled for the first time in days. I think so too. As I turned off her light and headed to my own room, I realized that my quiet, predictable retirement had officially ended. Tomorrow would begin the adventure of raising Robert's granddaughter. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. But Emma was right. Being scared and being brave could be the same thing. And tonight, I was definitely both. 6 months after Emma moved in with me, we stood in the same family court where this journey had begun, waiting to hear whether our arrangement would become permanent. Emma wore her favorite dress, the blue one with small flowers, and held my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned not to take security for granted. The past 6 months had been the most challenging and transformative of my life. There had been difficult moments. Emma's first panic attack when I was late picking her up from school. The night she'd barricaded herself in her room after I'd had to discipline her. The morning she'd woken up screaming from a nightmare about losing another family. But there had also been unexpected joys. Teaching Emma to cook my grandmother's recipes. Reading together every night before bed. Watching her confidence bloom as she realized that our home was truly her home. That my love for her wasn't conditional on perfect behavior. Margaret, recovered from her heart attack and following doctor's orders to reduce stress, had become a daily presence in our lives. She picked Emma up from school twice a week and spent Sunday afternoons with us, providing the continuity Emma needed during the transition. The cabin remained our monthly sanctuary, our connection to Robert and Sarah, our family retreat where we could talk about grief and love and the strange ways families come together. Mrs. Hamilton, Judge Patterson said, bringing me back to the present moment. I've reviewed all the reports from Mrs. Chen, Emma's school counselor, and your medical team. How has the past 6 months been for both of you? Challenging but rewarding, Your Honor. We've learned to be a family together. Emma, you've been living with Mrs. Hamilton for 6 months now. How do you feel about that becoming permanent? Emma stood up straighter in her chair. I feel safe and happy. Grandma Helen keeps all her promises, and she loves me even when I make mistakes. Judge Patterson smiled. That sounds like good family life to me. Your Honor, my lawyer interjected, we've also prepared long-term security documents for Emma's protection. He handed the judge papers I'd spent weeks preparing, a comprehensive will naming Emma as my primary beneficiary, an education trust fund for her college expenses, and detailed guardianship provisions naming Margaret as Emma's backup guardian with financial support should anything happen to me. Mrs. Hamilton, these documents represent a substantial commitment to Emma's future. Yes, Your Honor, Emma is my granddaughter in every way that matters. I want her to have every opportunity for success. Judge Patterson reviewed the paperwork carefully, then looked at Emma and me with clear approval. It's evident that you've both adapted well to this arrangement. Emma, you appear happy, secure, and thriving. Mrs. Hamilton, you've demonstrated exceptional commitment to Emma's well-being. Emma grabbed my hand tighter. I'm pleased to grant permanent guardianship. Emma, Mrs. Hamilton is now legally your guardian. Emma squealed and hugged me so hard I nearly lost my balance. Margaret, sitting behind us, was crying with joy and relief. As we left the courthouse, Emma asked if we could go straight to the cabin to share the news. Of course, I said. We should tell them that the plan worked. What plan? I thought about the chain of events that had brought us together. Robert's secret visits, his hidden family, his careful provision for Emma's needs even after death. Had he somehow known that his passing would force me to discover his secret family? Had he hoped all along that I would step in to care for Emma if anything happened to Margaret? I think Grandpa Robert knew that families sometimes come together in unexpected ways. I think he trusted that if you ever needed me, I'd be ready to choose you. Emma considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Do you think he knew we'd love each other? I think he hoped we would. At the cabin that afternoon, Emma ran straight to the photographs on the mantel. Mama, Grandpa Robert, guess what? It's official now. Grandma Helen is my real grandmother forever. I stood in the doorway watching her, marveling at how naturally she'd learned to live with both profound loss and profound love simultaneously. Margaret joined me in the doorway. You've given her something I never could, she said quietly. What's that? The security of knowing that no matter what happens, she'll never be alone again. That evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Emma asked me the question I'd been expecting for months. Grandma Helen, do you ever wish your life had stayed quiet and predictable? I thought about my carefully ordered retirement plans, the quiet routines I'd cherished, the peaceful independence I'd thought I wanted. Then I thought about Emma's laughter echoing through my house, her homework spread across my kitchen table, her steady breathing from the next room that told me she was safe and sound every night. Emma, a year ago I thought I wanted quiet and predictable, but I've learned that love makes everything louder and messier and more complicated. Is that bad? It's the best thing that ever happened to me. Emma curled up in her rocking chair, clutching the stuffed rabbit that was still her nighttime comfort. I'm glad Grandpa Robert's secret brought us together. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I thought about Robert's final gift to both Emma and me. He'd given Emma 8 years of grandfather love and provided for her security. He'd given me the opportunity to discover that my capacity for love was far greater than I'd ever imagined. His deception had hurt. His secrets had complicated everything. But ultimately, his hidden family had become my greatest blessing. Grandma Helen, yes, Emma, I love you forever. I love you forever, too. 1 year after I'd first opened that cabin door, expecting to find evidence of Robert's betrayal, I'd instead found my future. Not just his secret, but my second chance at motherhood. Not just his hidden family, but the family I'd been meant to have all along. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're brave enough to open doors we're afraid to open, and sometimes the families we need are the ones we never knew we were missing. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.